name is Jara. I teach people how to garden with a primary focus on growing food. Today I wanted to show you guys my beautiful kale. Who doesn't love to grow kale? This particular variety right here is lacinato kale, also known as dinosaur kale, and quite honestly this is probably my favorite one, and I'll explain more about that later. Kale is a very easy crop to grow. I think it's a great introduction to the brassica family, which also includes broccoli and cauliflower. It's also a long-lived annual if it's growing in the right conditions. I love growing kale. It is all over my garden, and I want to show you guys how to be successful growing kale as well, from seed all the way to harvest. Let's talk about cultivar selection, because when you go buy seeds for kale, there are literally hundreds of different varieties. Really the only difference between them is color, the leaf texture, and some of them have a higher heat tolerance than others. You can find kale in so many different colors, from just green or dark green like this one, purple, or even some that have white variegation. As an example, this lacinato kale has a very deep dark green color. Another example is this scarlet kale, which has more of like some purple tones and purple veins. Another difference between the kale cultivars are its leaf shape. This again is the lacinato. As you can see, it's very long and bumpy. There's some kale with like frilly leaves like this ragged jack. Some kale have these curled ruffle type leaves. This particular variety is called Vates Blue Scotch Curled Kale. In general, the difference in the varieties is just their color and leaf shape. Flavor-wise, in my opinion, they all taste the same. There are some cultivars that are said to be a little bit more heat tolerant than others, like Ethiopian kale or this lacinato kale. Before you plant something or start the seeds, I always recommend that you figure out where you're going to grow it first. Site selection is really important. In general, anything that is grown to eat its leafy greens, like kale and lettuce, they really only require about 6 hours of sunlight. Kale in general grows really well in a soil that is rich in organic matter, so it's really important to add some compost in there if you have to. And putting mulch at the base of the plants really helps, because if they dry out or lose a lot of water in that soil, they can have a bitter flavor. So I like to add a nice thick layer of mulch. Another thing you might have to consider is staking, because some of these cultivars actually get pretty tall, like the lacinato kale that I was showing you. If I have to stake my kale, quite honestly, I just get some short T-posts like the 4 or the 5 foot ones, drive them into the ground right next to that kale, and then I just tie it on to that T-post. I have an extra tip for you guys, but first, if you want to learn more about gardening, make sure you subscribe to my channel. I am posting videos almost on a weekly basis about all different types of crops, showing you how to grow them from seed all the way to harvest. So make sure you subscribe, that way you get notified whenever I post new videos. So my extra tip is more applicable to those of you that are gardening in zones 8 and up, where you have very mild winters and really hot summers. You could potentially get your kale crops to be a long-lived annual instead of just surviving for a season. For example, in the warmer climates, usually we start our kale seeds at the end of summer to transplant during fall, and I'll explain more of that later. That way they grow through our coolest times of the year, which would be fall, winter, and spring. Usually by the time summer comes, all the kales just start dying, like literally overnight. It's just way too hot. We're getting days and days in a row of temperatures 90 and above, and they don't like that. They're cool weather crops. But that lacinato kale that I was showing you guys has been growing in my garden for almost 2 years. Okay, that is insane. I've never had a kale crop last me that long. I've had collards or like tree collards last me that long, but not kale. So I'm really impressed by that lacinato kale. It also goes by the names dinosaur kale and black Tuscan kale. And if you're going to ask me which one is my favorite kale to grow, I'm going to say it's that one, because it has lived in my garden so long. It has a decent heat tolerance. It even survived 2 hurricanes in a row back to back. So I'm so impressed. And that thing is as tall as I am. I definitely have to stake that one up to a T-post. The reason why I think that one is doing so well in my garden is because it is in a spot that gets pretty bright morning sun, but complete afternoon shade, okay? My house is right next to it, and it casts a shadow during the afternoon, and it covers the whole plant, and that really shields it from the most intense sun and heat of the day, which is in the afternoon. And I think that's why it's so happy in its spot and growing, all this time. My tip for you, if you are in zones 8 and up, make sure you grow your kales in a spot that gets a lot of morning sun, hopefully, those 6 hours, but complete afternoon shade. And if you're looking for kale seeds, or my very favorite, the lacinato kale, I definitely have tons of seeds on my website for kale, other vegetable crops and plants. I don't know if you guys could see all of the bees on these white flowers. This is actually some cauliflower that bolted because we had a really warm winter and it was flowering. I was about to yank them out, but then I noticed that the bees are going crazy over those flowers. So I'm gonna leave them in until the absolute last moment when I actually need to plant something in this area, because the bees love it and it's a great way to attract them to my garden. But let's talk about when you're supposed to sow your seeds for kale. General guidelines say that you can start direct sowing seeds for kale about 12 weeks before your first frost of the winter season, or you can direct sow them outdoors as soon as your last spring frost date has passed. But if you're in the warmer zones like 8 and up, direct sowing the seeds after your last spring frost date has passed is way too late, because it very, very quickly gets hot here. Already, when I'm filming this video, it is the middle of February and I am sweating and everything is bolting. So if I were to start seeds right now, because the second week of February is my last spring frost date, it's too late. It's already really hot outside. So as another guide, I like to look for the very first month in my fall season where the max average high temperature finally hits below 85. To figure that out, I like to use a website called plantmaps.com. You put in your zip code, it tells you a lot of really good to know gardening information for your area, like your garden zone. And at the bottom, it has a chart broken up by month that shows you the average maximum high temperature and average lowest temperature for that month. Taking my garden as an example, the very first month during fall, where the average high temperature is finally below 85 degrees Fahrenheit, is the month of October. So I can start direct sowing seeds outside in my garden the month of October. To give you an idea, they will typically grow perfectly fine straight through my winter and my spring. And as soon as June comes around and it's really, really hot, we start getting rains almost every day. They just start dying off. And that's normal. That is the growth cycle of growing kale in the warmer climates. If you're in a colder climate like zones 7 and below, then you're going to probably grow your kale spring, summer, and then fall. Your kale plants will probably die with your cold fronts, when your cold season starts, if it gets cold enough, because kale can also withstand some pretty low temperatures, sometimes all the way down to about 25 degrees Fahrenheit. If you want to go the transplant route, then you're going to plant them in your garden 12 weeks before your first winter frost of the season arrives. I'm a huge proponent for starting everything from seed because you save so much money. So I'm going to show you how to do that. If you're going to direct sow the seeds, then simply pull back any mulch, weed out the area. And I like to take like a fork or something like that and kind of scratch up the surface. I like to also mix in some kind of fertilizer, whether it be just a generic balanced fertilizer, or my personal favorite for anything that you're growing to eat just the leaves, leafy greens, kales, lettuces, cabbages, stuff like that. I like to sprinkle in a good amount of blood meal because that's an organic fertilizer that's really high in nitrogen, and that will simply just promote a lot of lush leafy green growth. I just sprinkle on my fertilizer, scratch it back into the surface with that fork, and then lightly sprinkle some seeds over there. You don't need many seeds. Usually germination rates for kale are very high, so just a couple seeds is more than enough. Once I sprinkle the seeds, I like to kind of pat them down so they make good contact with the soil, and then mark the area so you don't forget about it, because you have to keep it nice and moist. Water it daily so that way it will germinate. If you want to start your own transplants, that's really easy too. When it comes to kale, I like to start my seeds in a bigger pot to begin with. I don't like to use like these 72 cell seed trays because they very quickly outgrow this, and then I'm gonna have to waste time potting up. So I prefer to start kale seeds in a 4-inch container, and if you want to get these same ones, I do have a link below to Amazon in the description that will take you to these same pots. But this 4-inch pot will house them for the duration of their seedling growth until they are ready to be transplanted. I recommend that you start them in their pots or sow the seeds 12 weeks before whatever your target date is for actually planting them into the garden. Using my garden as an example, my target date would be in October because that's the first month where my maximum average high temperatures finally falls below 85 degrees Fahrenheit. So that will land me at the end of July or the beginning of August. However, if you're in zones 8 and up, I'm zone 9B, it is way too hot outside. So if I were to start my kale seeds outside, they would actually get stunted in growth and potentially never grow any bigger for me, because that's what happens when they're exposed to too much heat. Because of that, I start them indoors only start them indoors. If you're in a warmer climate and you're going to be starting seeds during like the end of summer, start them indoors. Trust me, I can't tell you how many times I planted them outside or even just moved the pots outside to get some sun, and they were stunted because it's still way too hot during those months. In summary, my target date is October, so I'm going to start the seeds in these 4-inch pots 12 weeks beforehand. That'll land me at the end of July, somewhere around there. And then when October rolls around, these should be nice and big, a little bit bigger than this example right here, and they are ready to be transplanted into the garden. So I'll show you how to sow these seeds. As you can see, they're pretty small seeds. A general rule of thumb is the smaller the seed, the less deep you have to sow them or, cover with dirt. So I don't even cover these with dirt. I just sprinkle a couple on my little containers and then press the seeds down into the soil so they make good contact, and make sure you keep these nice and moist, because if they dry out, the seeds will not germinate. This is some scarlet kale here, but once your seedlings start growing and they put on a couple leaves, you can actually start fertilizing. I like to use a liquid fertilizer high in nitrogen, for example, like fish emulsion. And just make sure with seedlings that you follow the directions on the fertilizer, but cut that in half. So for example, if the directions said 1 tablespoon of fertilizer per gallon of water, I would do half a tablespoon of fertilizer per gallon of water. And that is to make sure you don't burn your seedlings, because that can definitely happen. But fish emulsion is a great one. It's high in nitrogen and it's organic, so you run less of a risk to burn your plants with organic fertilizers. So yeah, once you start getting a couple leaves, you can start fertilizing with something high in nitrogen, and that will facilitate rapid growth and healthy transplants. And when they're ready to be transplanted, you're just going to dig a hole. I always recommend that you put some kind of fertilizer in your planting holes. Mix it up with the soil, and then just pop your transplant in. Now that your kale plants are successfully growing in your garden, here's what you need to know to take care of the plants. When it comes to water, kale actually likes just a consistent supply of water, not too much because you don't want to cause root rot, but if it does dry out, it will cause a bitter flavor in the leaves. I always like to do the finger test, so I will stick my finger, poke it into the ground, and if it's dry up to my second knuckle, then I know it's time to water. If you're in Florida, you're probably growing kale during fall, winter, and spring, which is actually our dry season, so just make sure you stay on top of checking your kale plants. Obviously, if they're wilting, they need some water. You don't really need to prune kale leaves unless they're heavily diseased or turning yellow or it's dead, old growth. It's wise to remove that stuff off the plants because it will attract bad pests that are attracted to stressed out parts of plants, or it can even be a host for a lot of leaf diseases and cause that to further spread in your garden. As far as fertilizing, I give them a good initial dose of fertilizer when I direct sow the seeds or when I'm transplanting them. But in general, I like to just fertilize them with whatever you have, something balanced on a monthly basis, just to keep the nutrients growing and promoting a lot of lush leafy green growth. Lastly, you'll probably get some leaf diseases at some point. I mean, they are susceptible to like powdery mildew, blight, spots, and stuff like that. Now, I have one treatment for all leaf diseases, and that's 1 cup of hydrogen peroxide per gallon of water. It basically kills the pathogens, whatever it is that's causing the leaf diseases, and it cleans off the leaves. If you see any heavily diseased leaves or old dying leaves, remove them because they are basically a host for whatever that pathogen is, and it will help it continue spreading throughout the plant. So just remove these out. Kale is pretty quick to start producing something harvestable from seed, usually in about 3 months. I like to give them about 3 months time. But you can start harvesting these baby leaves just like this. They're really tender and they tend to be a little bit more sweeter in flavor. Once the plants mature, I mean, they start producing tons and tons of leaves. To harvest the leaves, I just break off what I need. This lacinato kale is crazy. It's taller than I am. At first it was just one main branch, but then it just kept growing and now it's forming side shoots. I have never seen a kale variety with all these side shoots and other branches. This kale plant has been here for over a year and a half now. It survived 2 hurricanes, like I said, so I'm very biased. This by far is my favorite one, and just look at all of this growth. I am harvesting from this weekly, multiple times a week. And if you didn't know, kale actually tastes the sweetest after a frost. So if you get like a light frost or something like that in your area, go taste the kale. You'll notice a big difference in the sweetness. If you have any questions, you're welcome to comment below. I check my comments regularly so I can answer them. Or if you have a particularly favorite kale variety or some tips for me, please comment below. I learn just as much from you guys as you do from me. Thank you for watching and happy gardening.